Well, David Van Reybrook joins us now, and also here is journalist and author Toby Young. Let's first of all just see whether we agree about the actual premise, which is that, politics is certainly rising in terms of people's interests, but there is a bit of a collapse of confidence and trust in politicians.
I think that's true, but I'm not sure that you can cite the recent result in the Brexit referendum or the rise of Donald Trump as evidence that democracy's in crisis. I think that's confusing outcomes you don't approve of with a sort of wholesale crisis in democracy. My experience of the Brexit referendum is that it actually showed democracy in rude good health. I participated in a lot of debates, there was a lot of interest in the issue, turnout was high, and the fact that there's a lot of people complaining is only because the result was so close, and that suggests people took it seriously and thought about it quite carefully.
So why do you think it is failing?
It's indeed not about Donald Trump or Brexit. The figures are rather alarming if you look at what Transparency International has been presenting. It turns out that 66% of people living in Britain believe that political parties are corrupt or extremely corrupt. And this holds true for most of Western countries. The least trusted institution in public life all over the West are the political parties. Now, what does it say about the health of Western democracy if the key players are seen as the most corrupt institution you can imagine? I think that is greatly worrying.
Certainly stoked today by the revelations in the Democrat Party that they were actively, the party itself was actively undermining one of its candidates.
Yes, I mean, I think, but in every US presidential election, you have these scandals and everyone thinks that we've reached rock bottom.
All right,
people have been saying we've been reached rock bottom for almost 100 years.
Let's get a solution and look at that.
I think we've been doing democracy for about 3,000 years. We've only been using elections since 200 years. So we should stop thinking that democracy boils down just to elections. I think elections can be useful, but they should be supplemented with more interesting forms of public engagement. People have a right to vote, but they also need a right to speak now. And a referendum is one step better. You're only ticking a box next to somebody's name, but next to a yes or a no or a remain or a leave. I mean, that's already an improvement, but it's still quite primitive if your voice is reduced to ticking a box next to yes or no. So a next step would be to see what they did in Ireland. I think what they did in Ireland makes Ireland the most innovative democracy in the West right now. They put together 66 Irish people drafted by lot with 33 elected politicians to talk about a number of constitutional changes, and the most important one was the one on same-sex marriage. Now, this was an issue which could not be tackled by politicians alone because they were afraid of losing next elections. And by putting people together, drafted by lot, and elected officials, they could come further. And the result was that people could go to a referendum. So it's not about forgetting referendums and elections. You have elections, you have referendums, and you have an interesting input from, say, like a citizenry that has been informed.
But you must admit that if that had happened in Brexit, people would have been at least a lot wiser about the issues.
I think people were pretty well informed about this. I don't buy the idea that they were deceived, duped, didn't make a proper rational decision. I think David's idea is interesting and could work if combined with democratic processes in a small way. I think the problem with trying to generalise it is, first of all, there's a problem of accountability. How do you hold the citizen rulers accountable if they're not submitting themselves for re-election after they've made a decision? There's a problem with legitimacy. If unelected people have played a big part in making a decision, will a majority of the electorate accept it? One of the reasons democracy works is because it succeeds in manufacturing consent. And I think the third problem is, will those citizens...
Because what's the difference between his panel, which has 30 of the elected representatives interacting with experts, what's the difference between that and a select committee?
Well, you're not empowering the select committee to make kind of constitutionally significant decisions which then affect the entire electorate. So I think it is a bit different. And I think the third problem with it is that it's quite hard for individual citizens who don't have any particular mastery of a subject to resist the influence of experts and technocrats who may just be representing the status quo. You need a political party. You need an ideology if you're going to take on vested interests.
I can see that defending random sampling or lottery as a way of improving democracy at first sight, it really does sound a bit funny. But we're using lottery every day now in politics, and we're using it in the worst possible way, and we call it opinion polls. With opinion polls, we ask 1,000 people what they think when they have not been thinking. And it does influence government. It would be much more interesting to ask 1,000 people what they think after they had a chance to think, after they had a chance to engage with experts, to engage with politicians, and to talk with each other. And then they can come up with a solution or a suggestion that is much more founded, much more grounded, much more rational than what you get from an opinion poll right now. And if that goes through a referendum, it's perhaps more trustworthy as an argument, as information, than the arguments put forward by people who have their own vested interest and their own career ambitions.
David Van Reybrook, Toby Young, thank you both very warmly for coming in.